You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake and Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. Coming to you now, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug. And I'd like to thank you for tuning in this afternoon to Long Waves here on KYRS. I'd like to say at the beginning of the show that the opinions and views expressed here are solely those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of KYRS, its staff management, or of its underwriters. Well, today I've got to talk about the eternal present, that we have no sense of history, no sense of future, no sense of past, no sense of how things fit together. Instead, things just appear out of nowhere, like that suicide deer you see when you're driving late at night on two-lane blacktop. It just comes out of nowhere, and there it is in front of you, and then it's gone. And we go, wow, that was weird, and then something else will happen later. But it's important for us to have a sense of history and a sense of perspective so that we know how events, as they appear on our TV screen or on our internets or in our news feeds or wherever, so we know how these events fit together so that we don't fall back on the taken-for-granted, commonsensical approach to such things. Admittedly, the world is a dangerous place. And right now, it's especially dangerous. We've got all these little hot spots where all kinds of strange things are happening. We could talk about Ukraine, and I will, because I usually do. We could talk about the Middle East, and I will, because I usually do. We could talk about climate change. We could talk about things closer to home, such as the emergence of the prerogative state, which I've done one show on, and I'll continue to talk about. The idea that there's a state that exists above the state, and this higher state, the prerogative state, gets to make its own rules. So they can torture and kill. They can suspend habeas corpus. They can do all of these things that the normative state can't do because it has checks and balances. But this is one of the things we could talk about. We could talk about the rise, which is linked to the prerogative state, of the the police state, which daily, it seems, displays its power and kills and steals and imprisons with impunity and very little recourse to something that would look like law or justice. It's hard to put all of these things together, especially when it's only details that are largely thrown at us. Details about ISIS, details about Al-Qaeda. And it's hard to, I feel like I need a scorecard just to keep track of what's what and who's who. Okay, so we've got Shia and Sunni. All right, there's a little framework we can work with. Shia, that would be Iraq and Syria and ISIS. And then we've got Sunni, and that would be Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda and probably al-Nusra. But that really doesn't help much. It doesn't really give us the historical perspective. So we know who the players are. We kind of know who hangs with who. But the historic perspective, the social perspective, is the bit that's missing. And one of the things that hinders it hugely is the abject toadying of the American news industry. The propaganda wars that are all around us, especially on issues that are key to U.S. policy. So U.S. and Russia, Ukraine and NATO, there is this tsunami of propaganda coming from the U.S., counterstatements coming from the Russians, stuff coming from NATO, which supports the U.S., other allies, other enemies. Everybody's got a dog in this fight. And it's complicated that it's very difficult to find meaningful, more or less truthful, or at least meaning to be truthful, accounts, statements, reports that one can rely on. Instead, we have the lies and distortions by governments and their mouthpieces. So on our side, we could talk about The Guardian. We could talk about the BBC. We could talk about the New York Times. Any number of Washington Post. We could talk about the mainstream television networks, which are openly playing the U.S. official song over and over and over again with very little dissent and very little critical analysis. So we're fighting a global war on terrorism, which I'm just going to call GWOT, because GWOT seems to fit it. And we don't know what it is. We don't know what it means. Well, terror, that's bad. But terror is one of those amoeba words. It means whatever it's convenient for it to mean. Are the actions of right-wing fanatics in the U.S. terrorism? Or are they just crazy people? Or are the actions of freedom fighters in this or that country terrorism? Well, it depends on whether they're on our side or not. And we've seen this again and again, from the Contras in Nicaragua to, the current events in the Middle East. So we know that the media are remarkably good at singing the official line. Occasionally, you'll get a true piece in the New York Times or the Guardian or the BBC or WAPO, but it's rarely to do with anything in foreign policy. And whenever governments need something run, they know exactly who to take it to. So what we understand is that debate and the parsing of information is carefully controlled. It's constrained. It's limited. You have to use the right phrases. You have to identify the right enemies. You have to use the right sort of historical contexts. And I'll talk about this in some greater detail in a minute. So this kind of approach to media fits very, very well with the way that we live our lives anyway. We live our lives in this eternal present, where events pop up with no historical or political context. They have no meaning. We don't have a time to catch our breath, assess, criticize before the new event is upon us. So, ISIS is a NATO creation? Does that sound crazy? It's not something you would see in the major news. Not in this country, but Deutsche Welle, one of the big German news organizations, reports that equipment and fighters routinely flow through Turkey into Iraq, where they fight the Iraqi government and now U.S. troops. Okay, well, this is something we've known for a while, that Turkey's been kind of an open door for people wanting to get into Syria, wanting to get into Iraq. But what does this mean? Is Turkey acting against NATO? Or is NATO actually supporting ISIS? And how would we know? And why would we do that? How would we explain? The whys change daily, depending on political expediency. Is the U.S. trying to support al-Qaeda to punish Syria and Iran? Well, that would undermine the stated U.S. goals in supporting the Iraqi government. But it seems to be the case if you look at the actions in Syria. So let's look at the actions in Syria for a moment, shall we? Tony Carlucci wrote a really nice piece quite recently called "With Aleppo Encircled, West Seeks Wild Card to Save Its Terror Hordes." And in this Aleppo is a city in northern Syria, one of the big cities, and it was invaded from NATO territory by various insurgent groups. And the Syrian armies fought back, and they've encircled Aleppo, and they're about to take it, it looks like. And this is where it gets interesting. Quoting now, "The desperation of militants facing this final battle in Aleppo is indicated by their Western sponsors' attempts to broker a ceasefire and arrange aid," in quotes, "to reach them. Similar attempts were made in vain during the closing phases of the Battle for Homs in mid-2014, with the city of Homs having been an epicenter of terrorist activity beginning in 2011, and now under the control of the Syrian government. Small pockets of militants have been isolated within Homs." So the government's gradually sort of restoring some sense of order into this country that's been flooded by largely Western-backed terrorists seeking to overthrow their government. And The Guardian, as Carlucci points out, has been absolutely front row among the propagandists in attempting to, as he says, form a narrative extorting global security by claiming that NATO needs to establish a no-fly zone over Aleppo and repel the Syrian forces so that, quote, "moderate rebels can hold on to the city and repel the lingering Islamic State forces." Well, that's just cloud cuckoo land and doesn't at all fit the reality on the ground. And Carlucci continues, "Of course, the reality is that the U.S. has merely used ISIS as a pretext to violate Syrian airspace, with the next step being to establish long-planned no-fly zones, if possible, to thwart the Syrian Arab army. Just as in Libya, the no-fly zone would simply hand the rest of Syria over to ISIS and other al-Qaeda affiliates. Clearly the most dominant military force engaged in fighting the Syrian government, and clearly the recipients of the vast majority of material supplied by NATO and their regional partners, most notably Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Israel." Well, golly gosh. So we've got our good friends, the Saudis, who've long funded al-Qaeda. We've got Qatar and Israel all funding al-Qaeda affiliates to overthrow the Shiite government of Syria. Help me out here. Does this make any consistent sense? Is anybody actually in control of these decisions? Carlucci continues that while The Guardian claims the remaining encircled militants in Aleppo are at odds with ISIS, the same report admits these same militants coordinate with U.S. State Department-listed foreign terrorist organization al-Nusra. And these same ISIS forces that are allegedly at odds with moderate rebels have seen thousands of so-called moderates defecting into their ranks recently, bringing with them large sums of Western cash and weapons. That al-Qaeda, both al-Nusra and ISIS, seems to thrive along the Turkish border indicates that NATO is not at all going to NATO support is not at all going to moderate rebels, but instead intentionally to al-Qaeda or to moderate NATO groups that are known to be working with or soon to join al-Qaeda. So we have what he calls here a menace of our own creation. And he refers to an article from 2007 by the Pulitzer Prize winner Seymour Hersh, one of the great American investigative reporters. And I have this article posted on the Facebook page for the show, an article called The Redirection. And Hersh points out in this that the West conspired to intentionally build up and unleash terrorist mercenaries affiliated with al-Qaeda across the Arab world to fight a proxy war against Iran and its growing arc of influence. U.S. support was to be laundered through Saudi Arabia as to maintain a veneer of plausible deniability. Clearly, what is unfolding in Syria today is the verbatim manifestation of Hersh's meticulous 9-page report. And I do encourage the listeners to look at this report and read it with some care. So what we have is this ongoing conflict in Syria is not a civil war. And Carlucci points out that they need to be very clear in pointing out that this is not a civil war. It's a terrorist invasion. And that any strategy must include the Syrian government, which is, he points out, the most capable force confronting al-Qaeda in the Levant since 2011. So it seems unlikely, though, that those folks in power have any such thoughts about doing any such things. It seems exceedingly improbable. And it's all very hard to follow, no? Perhaps these constant quick shifts in government positions and government policies is in part deliberate. Let me think about this for a minute. Because they've got to shift positions constantly. We're against al-Qaeda, we're for al-Qaeda. We supply al-Qaeda, we train al-Qaeda, we bomb al-Qaeda. It's this back and forth game. And we remember where al-Qaeda came from. Initially, we trained up the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. Al-Qaeda jumped on the bandwagon. So, again, a disaster of our own making. But these constant shifts of policy of, if it's Tuesday, we're at war with Oceania, we're not at war with East Asia. This is deliberate to sell policies and decisions already made to the American people. And they necessarily require simplistic, jingoistic statements that appeal to God and country, Gott und Reich. And these sorts of slogans that have appealed to people are engineered to appeal to people who are distracted, naive, uninformed, and generally simplistic. In other words, the American electorate. I'll say it again. Distracted, naive, uninformed, and generally simplistic. Right and wrong. Good and bad. My country. They don't do this because they want the consent of the American people. They just want approval for what they've already decided to do or have already done. Nobody's asking for our consent before the U.S. invades a country, before the U.S. goes off on another GWOT escapade. This is simply for our approval, to keep us happy and vaguely supportive of whatever's going on. It is hard to reduce history to sound bites, especially when history must be made to conform with current government policies that constantly change and morph to fit the pet philosophies of whomever currently pulls the strings. And one of the groups that we have currently pulling the strings are a lot of neoconservatives, neocons, a lot of leftovers from the Bush administration who've dug in. I think one thinks of Valerie Nuland, the U.S. Secretary of State, envoy, Special Europe, the one who's had her hands all over Ukraine. Think of Pyatt. Think of all the people in NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, so-called, which we've also talked about on this show. Whoever is currently pulling the strings has their own pet philosophies about how things are going to go, and it really doesn't seem like it matters a great deal what any new president does or says or wishes to do. The neoconservative movement has ensconced itself so deeply in the State Department and the military, and it was a deliberate policy of them to do this under the Bush and Cheney administration. These people are so deeply embedded that effectively this philosophy controls most of America's political actions domestically and overseas. And if you want to understand their policies, if you want to understand what they laid it all out back in 1999, I want to say, in a book, a pamphlet called Rebuilding America's Defenses, where they lay out a system, lay out a plan for the U.S. to essentially dominate the world. The pet philosophies. But we don't see that, we don't dive into it, and even that's kind of a very short little wave. This was just a decade or so ago, and it's hard to put it into political philosophy. It's very difficult to take this document, the Rebuilding America's Defenses, and put it into a political or historical perspective. Fortunately, there's some really smart people out in the world who make good careers out of doing this. One of them is a man named Adam Curtis, who's a documentarian, a man who makes documentaries for the BBC. A couple of his really great series I would recommend strongly, and you can find these. One is The Century of the Self by Adam Curtis, which is available online. And the other is The Power of Nightmares. And these are in-depth, long-wave kinds of analyses. Century of the Self is the emergence of this remarkably crippled individual focused only on itself, its own interests, divided from community, separated from others. And The Power of Nightmares is about basically the rise of the neoconservatives and the simultaneous rise of the jihadists. Well, Adam Curtis has a new series, which has just come out on BBC, a new series of films called Bitter Lake. As I say, it's just been released, but it's not yet available in the U.S. unless one is somewhat clever. And if you wish to watch this, if you wish to watch Bitter Lake, I recommend you get an add-on for your browsers called Hola, H-O-L-A. It's free. And use it to tell your computer that you're actually in the UK. Now, it only works on things that are going back and forth through your browser, not on all your traffic. But it'll work well enough that you can watch the film if you want. Unless, of course, it's illegal, in which case I'm not suggesting you do this at all. Anyway, Adam Curtis argues in this series of films, Bitter Lake, that politicians deliberately play the complexity card as a strategy to confuse and mislead both their own people as well as their political enemies, both foreign and domestic. So you throw constantly changing stories, constantly changing activities. One day you're a lefty, one day you're a righty, one day you're very pro-religion, one day you're very pro-religious freedoms. And you shift positions constantly so that no one can pin you down. And it's even been suggested that this is something that Vladimir Putin does remarkably well. I haven't watched the whole series yet, but it is a clever idea, and it seems to work. I do know that the show contains a remarkably good history of the Saud clan, especially King Faisal, and a very good coverage of parts of the Wahhabi people and tribe, and the spread of their peculiar and, dare I say, now familiar brand of Islamic fundamentalism, 18th century social models and legal systems, as well as their propensity to violence to enforce their beliefs. It's a good little series. I recommend it. So, all of this, excuse me, all of the rise of the Wahhabi, this Islamic fundamentalism, this 8th century idea of law and society, this use of violence to enforce religious beliefs. All this was done with the express encouragement of the United States, because the United States was having it's a different kind of GWOT back then. This was the global war against communism, GWOC, I guess we could call it. And the U.S. partnered with Saudi Arabia and strongly encouraged King Faisal to do this. And he thought it was a good idea because it basically gave the Wahhabis something to do, so they weren't plotting to overthrow his government. Instead, they were spreading Wahhabism with Saudi oil money to places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and throughout the Middle East. And these are precisely the places where we now find ourselves fighting the global war against terror. The global war on terror, the GWOT. But these long waves, we don't see these long waves. We don't see that Roosevelt met with King Faisal and encouraged close relationships. We don't see that Truman encouraged this global war against communism and was very happy that Saudi Arabia was getting on board with this. These remain hidden from us. And so Saudi Arabia, it just remains strange and confusing. We don't get it. It's not terribly confusing when you dive in. But we don't dive in, and no one encourages us to do it. It takes a bit of effort, a bit of digging, a bit of initiative, thinking for oneself, and these simply aren't attributes that are encouraged. All that being said, there are sometimes when what we see are naked, behind-the-scenes power plays. And boy, was there a doozy this week. John Boehner, Speaker of the House, that fellow of weepy tanning bed fame, decided to invite Benjamin, or Bibi to his friends, Netanyahu, to Congress on March 3rd. Okay, well, golly gosh. The issue with that is this came in the context of a number of other representatives and a couple of senators, I think of Louis Gohmert off the top of my head, telling Benjamin Netanyahu that they would follow his lead. Well, that seems tantamount to, if not treason, certainly disloyalty, and that Boehner would invite Bibi to address Congress, this happens on the 3rd of March, without bothering to tell the president until the deal was set. This is the height of disrespect. And Netanyahu didn't bother to coordinate this bit through the White House either. So now we've got Congress, or at least Boehner, thinking he's going to set foreign policy for the United States and that he's going to undermine the policies of the White House with this little trick, which some White House people have referred to as a slap in the face to President Obama. And there's also another bit to it, which is this Netanyahu's address to Congress occurs just 2 weeks, mind you, before his own election takes place in Israel. I mean, even Fox News is freaked over this. Chris Wallace and Shepard Smith last Friday had a frank back and forth about the absolute impropriety of setting up a speech by a foreign leader for the express purpose of undermining an American administration's foreign policy. This is way over the line. And even Fox News gets that. So that's how far over the line it is. Hunter's blog, which was reported on the Daily Kos, wrote this: the rationale for inviting Netanyahu is most specifically to undermine American diplomatic efforts in shutting down Iranian nuclear efforts, shifting momentum back toward potential American military action against Iran. Many in the Republican Party are keenly eager to see that happen, primarily the same neoconservatives who were keen to see action against Iraq. And isn't that a comforting thought? And it's informative to see the political risks those individuals are willing to take to nudge American policy closer to that preferred military confrontation. They'll have their bombing, damn it, even if it means being seen as publicly aligning themselves with foreign leaders rather than with their president. And there are a lot of factions who are pushing for this war with Iran. And the same ones who push for the war with Iraq because they just love their wars. They never get enough of their wars. Whatever the motivation, the manipulation of chaos, masquerading as order, could not occur without specific social conditions, as I said at the beginning of the show. Specific social conditions of our political, communal, linguistic worlds, right here in the U.S. Douglas Rushkoff wrote a book called Present Shock about this sort of thing and other fun things. In it, he mentions the idea of overwinding, which is a nice metaphor. Overwinding, we compress time into progressively smaller and smaller pieces, sometimes into singularities, so that history becomes one instance that we draw on. We try to overcome natural time. We try to save time. But this always comes with a price. You can take steroids to speed muscle growth, but it comes with a price. We try to overcome natural time by sleeping less, by using drugs, using coffee, but we pay for that as well. We try to save time by hurrying, and we lose our touch with the human pace and our touch with the connection of those around us. We have no patience for things that take time. Look at road rage. Look at the people who beep at you when you don't move fast enough when the light changes. Rushkoff cites an idea by Freeman Dyson, who was a futurist and I think a physicist. Dyson talked about 6 time frames that we need to have to understand our actions and their consequences in the world. So you've got the time frame of yourself, and that's maybe 100 years, but take out the first 18, 20 because they don't count. Then you've got the time frame of your family, which is maybe a few hundred years. I don't know. I think the Borgias hung on for about 500 in Italy in one form or another. Then you've got the time frame of your tribe or your nation. And that may be, how long do nations last? A few hundred, maybe 1,000 years. Tribes, maybe a bit longer. Then you've got the time frame of your culture. And the culture that we draw on extends into ancient Greece. It extends into the Mesopotamia. It's a very long wave. It's a wave of 5,000, 5,500, 6,500 years. So that's a very long time frame. Then we've got the time frame of the species. Thinking in terms of how long does a species live? Is this good in terms of the extent of the species itself, humans, or other species, but humans? So this may be some tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, but it is finite. There's an end to it. There's a beginning to it. There'll be an end to it. And then we have the timeline of the planet, which is some billions of years. How long the planet will be habitable is anybody's guess, but that's exactly the kind of thinking we need to have. If we were to take this chaos and put it into time frames, instead of looking at them as blips if we were to put it in the time frame of self, I'm of an age where I vividly remember Vietnam, where I vividly remember a number of the wars of South and Central America waged by the U.S., where I vividly remember a lot of the Middle East shenanigans and Gulf War doodah number whatever. So if I think about these things, over a stretch of 100 years or so, or a few hundred years, we can see, for instance, the Saud royal family in context as a force. We can see the Wahhabi in context as a force. We can see shifts in policy as a force. And for each of these time frames, self, family, tribe, culture, species, planet, we could examine current events. We could examine our own actions. How long does that water bottle that you just bought last in a landfill? 10,000 years? 20,000 years? Well, that would have implications, wouldn't it? For the culture, for the tribe or nation, the species, the planet. So being able to expand our time frames out of our immediate instant is essential to being able to ground ourselves in much longer spans of time, which also transforms our values and the way we see and think about things. But we don't do that. We don't even have yesterday or next year. And you take the obituaries of King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. Oh my goodness, you read half of these, and you would swear the man was a saint. The state visits Michelle's ugly looks and refusal to wear a covering on her head notwithstanding, praise the great man who rallied the Gulf nations, who great liberalizer, who blah, 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 blah. Well, he wasn't a liberalizer, and he was no friend of democracy. He was an autocrat who routinely had people beheaded for crimes, as well as other bits out of the Saudi legal system, chopping off hands, whipping, all of these kinds of things, who suppressed any extension of rights for women, except one or two token events. And the only honest obituary I saw of him was on The Guardian. So what did Abdullah do, King Abdullah? He rallied the Gulf nations against democratic rule, especially in Egypt, because we couldn't have democratic rule if they picked the wrong people, and that's key. The U.S., the West, the powers that be cannot have democratic rule if folks insist on picking the people we don't like. King Abdullah was essential to the growth of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, pouring millions, hundreds of millions into these organizations. And he was always our stalwart friend in the Middle East. I remember the U.S. used to refer to the two pillars of freedom in the Middle East. One of them was Saudi Arabia, and the other was Iran, back when it was ruled by the Shah, who, of course, we installed after a coup, where we took out Mossadegh, who was democratically elected and wanted to have a better price for the oil. I've talked about this. You can look it up. 1952, I believe it was. Mossadegh was toppled by a CIA coup. We installed a ruthless military dictator named from the Pahlavi family, the Shah of Iran. And the next 20 years were just a nightmare for political dissent, political freedom in Iran. Anyway, so there's a long history there. There's a U.S. love affair with the Saudis going back to Roosevelt and the end of World War II, when Roosevelt actually met with the Saud royal family. So Shia and Sunni did get along once with us and with each other until it broke, until it came apart until we broke it, basically. I think that's what happened. Anyway, Tom Englert in his Tom Graham had a lovely little thought. He says he has a new way of thinking, a new category in his mind that he calls what could possibly go wrong. All right? So he talks about how the U.S. now has boots on the ground in Somalia. You remember Somalia, Black Hawk Down, right? That was 1993. And now we've got, we've long had a secret base and a prison there, but we've got boots on the ground to advise and coordinate, blah, 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 blah. You know the drill. What could possibly go wrong? He refers to the concept of blowback. So send a drone over Yemen with the intent to kill, kick down doors in Afghanistan or Iraq, put boots back on the ground in Somalia, and you're going to be guaranteed unintended consequences and undoubtedly some form of blowback as well. Well, he's right. And we see this again and again and again, but we fail to see these as relating to blowback, as directly tied to U.S. actions overseas. They just pop up out of nowhere. Oh, why are these people so crazy? Why do they hate our freedoms? And we have simplistic, half-assed ideas about why they're doing it. Tom continues, tactics change, but the ill-conceived, ill-begotten, ill-fated GWOT, global war on terror, which long ago outran its overblown name, continues without end and without either successes of any lasting or serious reconsideration. No successes or any lasting or serious reconsiderations. And that's it. We keep playing this one-trick pony. We keep riding this one-trick pony and expect the outcome's going to be different. Or maybe we don't. Maybe chaos is the point. Well, he continues about the early GWOTsters. Quote, their idea of a snappy quip was, everyone wants to go to Baghdad. Real men want to go to Tehran. And they loved to refer to the greater Middle East as the Ark of Instability. That, mind you, was before they sent in the U.S. military. Today, 12 years later, that long-gone world looks like an ark of stability. While the U.S. has left the greater Middle East from North Africa to Syria, from Yemen to Afghanistan, a rolling catastrophe zone of conflict, refugees, death, and destruction. As it happened, the Bush administration's invasion in Afghanistan and Iraq proved to be the only genuine weapons of mass destruction around, loosing, among other things, what could prove to be the great religious war of all time. The greatest religious war of all time. So this is all in a lead up to another article, no less, which I'm going to get to in just a moment, by Nick Turse, which is about precisely how we're playing this game. You know, what it is we're trying to accomplish. So, before I do that, let's sort of pull it all back together again. Some of the distortions we see in media, some of the distortions in language, some of the lies, some of the twisted language, some of the distortions and all, some of these are deliberate. Some of these are designed to keep us angry at the wrong people, to cover our own evil and destructive actions from us, because everybody else knows we did it. We're just pretending we don't know. Kind of like 5-year-olds. Oh, I got no idea how it broke. And to provide a leaky umbrella of moral cover to legitimate our actions to ourselves and the world. So we can stand and say, oh, yeah, well, we didn't do that. And we do. We do it all the time. So sometimes these are deliberate. We see Radio Free Europe, which is a lovely propaganda tool. We see, what's the other ones associated? Radio Liberty or something like that. run by the same group. We see Shabahi, which is a propaganda service in the Horn of Africa. We see journalists and editors bought by administrations. We see the compliant news services whose owners and interests fit very well within the hierarchies of power. This is no problem for us at all. So let's look at one of these for a minute. You know, I love going on about Ukraine because it's such a great study in propaganda. And the New York Times really outdid themselves this week. But rather than listen to me drone on, I'm going to read bits of a piece by Robert Perry. Quote, "One danger of lying is that you must then incorporate the falsehood into the larger narrative, somehow making the lies fit." So we have Ukraine, where the European Union and the United States provoked a political crisis on Russia's border in November 2013. I'm quoting, then backed a coup d'etat in February 2014 and have presented a one-sided account of the ensuing civil war, blaming everything on Russia. Possibly the worst purveyor of this Cold War-style propaganda has been the New York Times, which has given its readers a steady diet of biased reporting and analysis, including now accusing the Russians for a resurgence in the fighting. One of the ways the Times has falsified the Ukraine narrative is by dating the origins of the crisis to several months after the crisis began. And I'll paraphrase here a little bit. So, the story doesn't start when the U.S. intervenes in Ukrainian political affairs, when the U.S. initiates a coup, when we had Victoria Nuland and John McCain over there trying to wean them away from Russia, and when that doesn't work, backing a right-wing coup to remove the elected president, Yanukovych, and put in one of Nuland's hand-picked characters, Yatsenyuk. Okay, it doesn't start there. No. It starts much, much, much later. So, the New York Times article mentions these little green men who just invaded Crimea and conquered it. Well, no. Russian troops were already in Crimea. It was part of a long-standing agreement with Ukraine for maintaining the naval base. What Russia did was just said, look, it's ours. And historically it had been. So this leads to another paragraph. The renewed fighting is dashed any hopes of reinvigorating a ceasefire, more honored in name than in fact. And goes on to demonize Putin. That he would fail to be staggered by the twin blows of Western sanctions and collapsing oil prices. Well, gee, you kind of underestimated that one, didn't you, folks? To assume that an attempt to get Ukraine to cut its long-standing ties with Russia and pull them into NATO, really? You don't think Russia's going to react to that? So you've got Kiev in the hands of extreme right politicians, including real Nazis, who regard Russia as a historic enemy. They conduct an ethnic cleansing of eastern Ukraine, where literally thousands of ethnic Russians have been killed. It's hard to imagine the Russians were going to sit on our hands, right? But none of this plays into the New York Times piece. It is so badly written, I don't think it could pass a journalism class. I really don't. And it is really hard, given the way they're framing it, to imagine how we avoid a genuine clash between Russia and the West. This is the scary bit. This is the scary bit. So, in November 2013, back to the article, Yanukovych learns from experts at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine that if he severs his business connections with Russia and goes with the EU, it's going to cost his country, Ukraine, about $160 billion, about 50 times more than the EU had estimated. The figure stunned Yanukovych, who pleaded for financial help the EU couldn't provide. This is what the magazine said, the Der Spiegel. So Western loans would have to come from the IMF and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, all of this crushed Ukraine. So Putin, this is before the coup, Putin offers a more generous package of $15 billion. Yanukovych backs out of the EU agreement, and that's when the trouble starts. Angela Merkel said, and I quote, "I feel like I'm at a wedding where the groom has suddenly issued new last-minute stipulations." So the deal collapses. The U.S. neocons put their boots on and get to work. Back to the article, quoting now. Assistant Secretary of State Nuland, a prominent neocon holdover who advised Vice President Dick Cheney, passed out cookies to anti-Yanukovych demonstrators at the Maidan Square in Kiev. At the Maidan Square in Kiev, and reminded Ukrainian business leaders that the United States had invested $5 billion in their European aspirations. I mean, do you see how nuts this is? Senator McCain, who seems to want war pretty much everywhere, joined Ukrainian rightists on stage at the Maidan, urging on the protests. A U.S. senator urging on the protests. And, of course, the U.S.-funded National Endowment for Democracy had all kinds of political operatives who supported the disruptions. The president of the National Endowment for Democracy identified Ukraine as, quote, the biggest prize and an important step toward toppling Putin. So now we see the real long game, toppling Putin. And then we had February 2014, when Nuland was telling U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, to F the EU, when the U.S. will figure out how to glue this thing, and picked the leaders the U.S. wanted, which we've talked about. So none of this makes it into the New York Times piece. None of this, which is beyond background, this is the actual meat of the issue. None of this finds its way into the Gray Lady's writing. So Americans really have no good idea of this history. We're living very much in a shrunken present. We're living very much with pinpoint views of world affairs and no understanding that has any duration, any longitudinal reach to it. And this is sad because it strips from us one of the great things that human beings have always been good at least for the last 7, 8, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years, depending on how you want to figure this. The human species masters one of the things that makes me really proud of humans. It's what the Polish linguist Korzybski called time binding. Right? We've learned to compress and store time in writing, in paintings, in architecture. We have scrolls and books, and now digital data, so we can take learned skills, we can take knowledge, and pass it on to the future generations. without them having to learn it again from the beginning. This, of course, assumes that we have future generations. This is a process very much analogous to the function of plants, which store sunlight, solar energy, for later use. We store knowledge, or at least we did, because in the eternal present, knowledge and wisdom have little place and even less currency. The loss of interest in wisdom masks a dangerous, if not a terminal phase of this culture and of this country. Uninformed and willfully stupid people cannot even meaningfully assent, much less question or disagree with policies and politics and wars. And so, we continue our descent into the stultified individual who knows what he knows, and nobody's telling him or her what to think. No siree, Bob. Nobody's going to tell me how to stop my children from catching preventable diseases like the anti-vaxxers. And no one's going to tell him or her not to hate the other, about whom, if they know anything, it is likely a lie placed there purposefully to fire hatred, division, mistrust, and to support violence. Oh, and by the way, the U.S. wants to spend $95 million per day for 10 years to rebuild our capability to threaten the world with global nuclear extinction. Oh, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. It's to keep us safe. That's what I'm supposed to say. It's to keep us safe and deter threats. And so, hold that thought, right? Hold that thought. This concludes today's show. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Long Waves with Gary Krug on KYRS, Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. You can write me longwaves at kyrs.org. You can find me on Facebook. That's Longwaves Radio on Facebook. I tried to get Longwaves. I think it's a surf shop. Longwaves Radio on Facebook. And you can also get links to the podcasts of previous shows, leave comments, and look at some of the articles which I link that are used in the shows. Thank you again for listening. And until next week, I'm out of here. Have a great week.